last time we finished book 9. No, 8.
8.
Reached book 9. And I'll go through our intentions. My intention was to be more structured. Ethan's intention was to see the qualities in the text. Mark wanted to apply the chapter to modern day. And then he wanted to find a response to the democratic man and determining the level of corruption that he was partaking in. So yeah, I wanted to break patterns. I definitely got my patterns broken. Not sure how much I was a part of that, but it happened. Which generally has been a really good experience for me. Yeah, still hard to be constructive within that, but at least getting exposed is important. So yeah, this tyrannical man is going to be placing himself in contrast. So we're going to get an oppositional binary going, which is interesting to think about the binaries and like maybe there is a justification for binaries within certain framings or whatever. Just, unjust, right? Light, dark, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's still in the structure of the text. They always use it. This must be so, right? And they're like, yeah. Or it must be the opposite. They've been playing with that throughout the text. The interesting thing for me on this book is there's nothing about the layers of the city. So I think this is the first time that this has happened. Like, they're not talking about class system. They're not talking about the need for the mixing. They're not talking about any of that, right? It stays at the individual level. And so it's a contrast, although I would say it's not a binary because they compare and contrast the tyrannical man against all the other man, right? And say which one's happier. And then they, at the end of the book, actually, they do this mathematical calculation, which is just, I mean, it's hysterical. To prove who's happier and how much happier, which it's just it's so funny. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, but I don't. There's more binary here than there's anywhere else. It's just binary for the sake of being absurd, as usual.
So my intention, well, let's be unstructured. So yeah, Ethan, are you there? No, he's not. Okay, we'll go to Mark. Application to the modern day. That was your intention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. I mean, I think we're at the end of democracy, so I'm just gonna apply this to what's happening now because it seems to be there.
Danny?
Well, the thing that kind of struck me most about this chapter is not really so much the ideas that I got out of it. It's more of the poetic nature of the language, like the sting of desire being the lord of the soul and having madness for the captain of his guard. I just like the pictures that it painted of I really like the poetry of the language mostly. So, I mean, when I was in Manhattan, I saw Sweeney Todd on Broadway, which is about, this guy who's disillusioned with the world and starts murdering a bunch of people. And I saw basically a rendition of Macbeth. So I've been like thinking a lot about madness. And in the tyrannical man. I don't really have an intention. So there's one is that's just where my mind is right now, and so I don't really know where to go with that. But then there's a second intention, which is what he does. Basically, I want to shore up my understanding of exactly what he's trying to, what's the main thrust of this book, because I think in book 10 he starts to kind of build on these ideas as he concludes the whole thing. Like, like in book 10 he starts hating on poetry and stuff like that, and he kind of references some of the points that he brings up here, and I don't have a complete understanding of that. So I guess one is just meditating on some of these aspects of myself. Like we probably don't think of ourselves as mad. And so I was talking to my sister, like for example, when I was watching Sweeney Todd, I was like, like it's kind of hard in terms of the writing. Like I don't really resonate with the character because it's like, okay, fine, you have these bad things that happen to you, and your wife is killed, and then you take this leap where you start murdering everybody, and I'm like, that seems like too big of a leap. And then in talking to my sister about that and Macbeth and other things that we did while I was in Manhattan, like I started to kind of see like, oh, like maybe I was holding myself back from actually experiencing those works as they, I like it was my own issue. Like I was not seeing things in myself that was actually preventing me from appreciating certain aspects of these different, artistic works. So same thing, like when I'm reading this and I start to, and the madness theme comes up, my brain just kind of like starts shutting itself off. It's like, oh, I'm not mad. Like, so I just became aware that I had that reaction to the text. So I kind of want to explore that a bit. So anyway, that was kind of all over the place, but I'll leave it at that. Madness and poetry and
What's your intention?
meditating on madness and fear and at the end is just, but then secondarily or maybe primarily getting a more clear understanding of what the main thrust is exactly in book 9, because I see he makes a bunch of different points, and at the end he makes a bunch of explicit conclusions, and how he gets there I just have some issues with how exactly he arrives at his conclusions.
Okay, Ethan, are you there?
With my
Something is
intention?
there. Oh.
Yeah, your intention.
Probably going to be something similar to what some of you guys said. Helping me recognize patterns like that in the world today, and how to look out for them.
Mhm.
How to recognize the behavior and the mentality, or we'll just call it the spirit of the tyrant. How to guard against that, or to look out for it, I guess.
Okay. So, did you want to reference something from book 8, Ethan? Like, just things that you still want to discuss?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. So, yeah, this is some notes that I made. So, at the start of book 9, we've elevated the tyrannical man to the top of the hierarchy. And so now there is a apples to apples comparison that we can make with the philosopher king. And so I think that's the framing where they're engaging from. It's like, okay, now we can stripe out things against each other and see how they compare. So it's interesting that the first move that they make is the comparison of the appetites in relationship to the democratic man as well, I think. So you have the unnecessary pleasures and appetites, and the pleasures are separated as lawful and unlawful. So it's interesting because I don't think they made that separation on the appetites. So you can maybe separate these realms, right? Like what is pleasure versus appetite, right? Like appetite is something that's necessary, right? There's a necessary component there, and pleasure is something that's coming from the will more than from the embodiment, I guess. And that's where I think the big problem with the tyrannical man lies.
The frame it seems that he puts towards the desires, the pleasure and the desires, is he says the desires are either wholly banished or they become few and weak. Like he has a very proactive stance. Like and at the end, I mean, the message at the end is get your own house in order, basically. But he, the message throughout all of this is like, it's never like there's not much fatalism here. This seems to be very like Petersonian responsibility theme stuff going on throughout this. That's what I saw in the text.
Well, yeah, but you have to if you're on top of the hierarchy, like, and they get into that actually. That
Yeah, I don't. It's not just for the people on top. Is really for everyone. And I think the interesting thing for me is, I mean, this book is unlike the other books. I mean, it does not go through that speaking about individuals, then speaking about groups, then speaking about the class system, then speaking about the city and what's good for the city. That's not in here, which is fascinating to me. And it looks to me, although I didn't seem very explicit, it looks to me as though what's actually happening is the individualistic nature of the democracy is what collapses you into tyranny, because you end up focused specifically on feeding your own needs and desires, which ironically doesn't work, right? It's rather explicit. Like the tyrant does not get his desires fulfilled, even though he's able to try to fulfill them, right? He's unconstrained. He can murder his parents. He can have sex whenever he wants with whomever he wants. Like he's imposing his will left, right, and center. And yet that at the same time doesn't fulfill his desires. It's not necessarily that it makes him unhappy, although it's worse, right? But it makes his desires unfulfillable. Like he can't be satiated at all. So I found that fascinating that the structure of the text has changed here in Book 9 in a rather distinct way. It started to change in Book 8 to some extent, but Book 9 is just, it's all the way down to the individual level.
Interesting. Interesting thing that you observed there. Yeah, once we're at it, the democracy places the ethic at the individual. So there's no virtue. There's nothing outside of the individual. And once the ethic just becomes individualism, it's just whoever. It just becomes a matter of arbitrary power, like postmodernism. Whoever happens to have the most amount of effective force becomes the person on top. So if I was born with bigger muscles than you, I'm gonna be the guy on top, for example.
Yeah, and he doesn't say who takes over, right? Like again, the structure has changed. So it's not some progression from where you are to where you're, to becoming the tyrant. There's no progression there. The progression's kind of assumed from the destruction or degradation of democracy. And, you know, In book 7, we're still talking about the city and what's good for the city. And in book 8, we're not really talking about the city at all, right? We're talking about what happens in a democracy with the people. And now in book 9, we're talking about an individual person, the tyrant, and how he relates to other
Right.
individual persons.
Yeah, I always thought this was interesting that there's not really much of a transition between democracy and tyranny. If anything, it's almost entirely the same thing. I always kind of looked at it as two sides of the same coin, but it could just be the same thing itself.
So it's interesting, right? Because what Mark was describing is like a fracturing, and so when we started with the philosopher, he's within a hierarchy, right? And like his whole relationship is predefined by the city that was designed by Socrates. So when that city breaks down, also the way the relationships manifest break down, right? So it goes to honor, to money, right? And like it becomes more plural and more plural. And then you get the democracy, right? Where what was the highest thing in democracy? Equality, I guess, or liberty, right?
Liberty.
Like liberty is almost universal, but still not, right? And then in some sense, in tyranny, the universality is reestablishing order because what it needs to suck in to manifest, right? Like this, and that's the flipping, right? Like that's the upside down world, I think, that Peugeot is talking about, where you just, yeah, you need to gather things in order to have something, and either you're sucking on the bones of your ancestors, or you're creating something yourself. And if you're creating something yourself, you're gonna suck it out of the bones of living people, and that's why there's so much slavery talk in the book.
Oh yeah, I like that. Well, I mean, or you can create with others, and then it's just generative and doesn't have
Where
either
did you
part.
get that? Where did you get that sucking on the bones from? That's good. I like that.
That's me making soup out of
It's always do with
Well,
soup, isn't it? If
there,
it's
there,
not soup, it's a bowl of ice cream with spoons. Always something with spoons.
Ethan, there is a lot of poetic language that is to that effect in 572, like Eish, or maybe slightly before there, when they're talking about the son and he's hanging out with these seducers, and they talk about how he's drawn into a perfectly lawless life, by which his seducers is termed perfect liberty. So like, and there's these class of what they call magicians and tyrant makers. There's this thread out there of seducers, magicians, and tyrant makers that have an influence on the son, and as the son spends company with them, there's some interesting poetic language about how, like, like what you would think of would be of liberty is actually the thing that enslaves you. It's very subversive in this subversive way. Another thing too, before that though, in 572b, we were talking about assumptions and stuff. They say, like, even in good men, there's a lawless wild beast nature which peers out in sleep. So like that kind of point is just not an axiom that is, I think, unfortunately common today. Like they had, that's just a statement that they could just say without needing to justify. And I think that's an important starting place too, that I think is missing in our culture.
Yeah, you have the liberty or the lack of constraint, right? That everybody is pursuing right now in our world. And once you have that, you have the ability or the power to make all of your quote unquote wildest dreams come true. So it's the lack of constraint and the ability to realize your fantasies, which are, yeah, that's this talk of liberty. Freedom from constraint. I think that's what they're talking about, isn't it? This liberty thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bloom translation calls it hostility to law.
Right. That would be
Oh,
right. Law would be constraint.
Right.
Sure.
hostility to law. Maybe we should start calling it that now.
And what the enchanters do is, the Bloom translations, is they implant a love in him to lead his idle desires, which insist on all available resources being distributed to them. So it's like, if you're not focused on doing something in a directed way, that opens up the space for these enchanters to take these resources and put them into other things.
Right,
He
but
go
also
on with the go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
it also goes into this idea that your comfort requires someone else's slavery. Right? And so, that's why comfort should be temporary. Like, you shouldn't enslave people forever, and maybe you become their slave so they can have comfort sometimes, right? Like, that's, the language in the book is kind of harsh in that way, I would say. And this is one of the sort of more interesting observations of today. Everyone's throwing around, that's slavery, that's slavery, that's slavery. Under the definition of slavery they're using, slavery is inevitable. And so the fact that something is slavery isn't surprising because, yes, but this doesn't resolve anything if it's universal, right? Now, okay, everyone's enslaved by something, to something, for something. Now what? Like, that doesn't resolve justice at all because a universal, justice has nothing to say about a universal, right? It cannot say anything about a universal. So, at what point, do you draw the slavery line? Because it's one of the great confusions in the translation is it slavery or is beholden to a better way to frame it? Like, these are translation issues at some point. I don't know, but I think that's where we get confused. We'll say in more contemporary era or error, as the case may be, where we're not understanding. You can cast lots of things as slavery, and fair enough, but you're not changing anything or fixing anything or intelligizing anything at all.
Well, I think the slavery has to do with the imposition, right? It's like you're not voluntarily doing this anymore because it's like an existential threat. And I think that's the thing, right? Like at a certain point, it's not a choice. It's like you get it into a binary, and like that's what the tyrant does, right? Like it reduces everything into a binary, right? Like I want this, and so you're gonna do this for me. And if you're not going to do this for me, all these other things need to happen. And they have to. Like we went into that last week.
Yeah, I agree. That's certainly the quest for liberty causes a compression back into the binary mode of thinking, which is obviously wrong. We don't live in a binary world. We're not little digital creatures, all pixelized, ones and zeros. It's not us. And it's like the binary's there, and they didn't have what we would call binary computing or anything back then. So it's kind of interesting that just a pattern, guys. It's just a pattern that's been recurring for thousands of years. And the problem of, as I said, the way they're defining slavery is it's a universal. And if it's a universal, like fine and fair enough, but also you're not resolving it, you're not changing it, you're not doing away with it. It's going to be there irrespective of what you think or do.
Really
Well, we
interesting.
can rename the slave master dynamic in the hard drives. Anyway, yeah.
Did they use the word drone in your guys' translation?
In
Yeah, the
mine,
winged drone.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm just seeing here. And when the other desires, filled with incense, myrrh, wreaths, wine, and other pleasures found in the company, buzz around the drone, nurturing it and making it grow as large as possible, they plant the sting of longing it. It's interesting, those things that they use are all the things that they use in liturgy.
Right.
It's a misappropriation of something. It's bringing something that's higher down to like we'll say the individual or the drone here, right? That's an interesting thing I just saw. Um, but yeah, this tyrant, it seems like they've completely where the philosopher king is orientated towards the higher things, the vertical causality, bringing things into the world and embodying them, whereas the tyrant is focused on things that are already created. So on one hand, you have a philosopher king that's cultivating creation, cultivating a garden, and the tyrant you have that's just consuming the garden and eating everything and not taking care of it. So yeah, the slavery came. I mean, maybe this is it, something there, but like when we keep thinking of slavery, it's just like you're taking something for granted, like you're taking the labor or the work, I guess you could say, of something for granted. That's what the tyrant's doing. He's taking everything for granted and consuming it, and not creating or generating anything.
Well, so the way that the tyrant is organizing the garden is by having it be self-referential, right? Because it needs to contain itself. So what, like it's this endless creation of containers, right? Like this identification against this reorganization within the identity, where new identities occur that then need to be contained as well. And it's just this endless
Yeah.
cycle.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
he's not willing to do anything. He just wants the garden to grow by itself so he can eat it without taking care of it or doing any of the work. Or it requires no wisdom, no sight, or anything. It's like if a baby grew up, just goes around eating everything, taking for granted the parents that provide everything for it. Which there's a
yeah.
lot of people like that. Like that's basically our society. It seems like.
Well, yeah, and I had an experience with that, right? It's like, why can't we just let things be, right? It's like, well, because they're not. Like, they are within something. Like they always are in relation, and like we have to take responsibility for that relationship. And
Mhm.
the way that the tyrannical man is trying to impose that responsibility is through law and reason, right? So he's trying to control himself through law and reason. And then there's two aspects of himself. There's the things that can be banished or that are weak and that can be under his control, or the things that run out of control. And then they go again into this poetic language. The man sleeps while they reign. The beast awakens from meat or drink. Then, parted from shame and self-constraint. So there's this taking over of this other entity that, well, it's other. Like I think that's the most important part, right? Like it's the other, and it's taking over, and it's taking over with a will of its own, a mind of its own, it starts laying down its own laws, and these laws that are laid down, they come to supersede whatever there was, right? From, well, emergence, I guess, right? From just being a man, and these passions, they reorient the person.
Well, I think the whole drone thing is all about whatever the desires that you have are, wherever they come from, they're not you, or they're not entirely you. And so you're pursuing them and they're not satisfying you anymore at some point. Right. It's sort of like too much of a good thing. Right. And so what happens is you just fall into this problem of not being able to integrate and not being able um, to find satisfaction, right? You're no longer able, in some sense, to interface with your desires correctly because they've grown bigger than you in some way, and now they control you. And so everything that happens is directed by that pursuit. Sounds rather like addiction, rather than by something, we'll say, that guides you from the outside in a way that affects other people, right? So your desires only affect you. That's why they're your desires. And I think that's sort of the key in the drone and the winged drone taking over to some extent is that whole interaction.
So the way I understood drones is because they made reference to that earlier in the Democratic Man, I think, right? And it was relating to the ruling class. So the ruling class is in some sense disconnected, right? Like I'm making the mental association with vampire. So the drone is stuck in the system, right? Because they're not adding value, but they are dependent on the system.
Yeah, well, I mean, it likened them to drones, but you can look at that as the collective desire of that class taking over the will of the people within the class. And I think that's how it was couched in the previous book. And then you see that same pattern here, right? Scaled down. We're no longer talking about classes, we're talking about individuals. And so you have a winged drone. I don't know what the significance of the wingedness of the drone is. It's not made clear here that I can tell. And I'm just not anywhere near scholarly enough to
Well,
know
I
the
looked
Greek
it
symbols.
up actually. So the drones are the only ones that are capable of sexual reproduction. And
Right.
when you have ants, for example, right, they don't generally have wings, so they have to grow wings and they fly out for sexual reproduction. So
Only
like
the
it might
queens.
with the
Only
queen, yeah.
queens.
No, the queen and the drones they fly. Anyway, the point being, like the queen is like flying with the drones, and the ones that keep up longest, they're the fittest, and she picks that one to mate with. Anyway, the point being that I think the wings are representative of the takeover of desire, right? Because like with those ants, they die afterwards, right? So they just chase and then they're done.
The imagery I got was one of swarming. Like one drone, not a problem. Two drones, maybe not a problem. Three drones, but eventually there's critical mass of drones, big problem, right? And then it's chaos. You don't know where they're coming from, where they're going. That's kind of the imagery I got from it. Because they talked
Right,
about
but here
tempering
it's
the
a
soul.
Here it's a single winged drone that takes over.
So yeah, but the reason is because they say when the other desires, and that's in the plural, and they say overflowing, like Ethan pointed out with incense or stuff like that. They kind of use some of that language, I mean,
right. The desires grow bigger than the will of the person. That's addiction, right?
Because like when we were talking about slavery and oppression, you can't, like in terms of the modern language and how we have these misconceptions, you can't use that. It's telling whenever you use the word slave where you're standing, because you can't use that language without presuming a sovereignty. And so here we have this idea of being a slave at either the individual and then the family. You have to govern oneself, and then the city, and then the family, and then the city, etc. Like the Christian models, like you're a slave to sin or you're a slave to Christ. And then we can argue about whether Christ calls you or you can voluntarily choose that. But the point is here we have like responsibilities and you have temperance that's are important. And it seems like at some point you hit a tipping point where it's like you're in trouble. Like, you want to, maybe some people are born to bronze or gold or to an oligarchic family. And like maybe you're dealt a better hand in life. But like in your situation, at every layer of the stack, there's always a theme of some degree of personal, or at least I've seen a theme of some degree of personal responsibility, and I've also seen the same theme of if you proceed down this path and hit this tipping point, like I've seen like watch out.
Yeah, well, okay. So the problem I have with that is that I don't think you're capable of right relationship when you're on the tipping point, so you can't rightfully judge it or discern that you're there or anything. So, and I think the implication is personal responsibility, but I don't see it anywhere like that. Like I don't think it's in the text.
He doesn't talk about a solution to the tyrannical man. Right, he doesn't talk about how you'd fight it or any of that stuff. He just says, this is what happens.
tyrannical man is a 4-year-old on his birthday.
Can confirm.
Uh-oh.
All the time.
when
All the
is my
time. Right.
I
Right. Well said.
object on behalf of my 4-year-old, and we'll have to go back.
Which one?
No, the actual 4-year-old. I object on his behalf because he's not tyrannical. 3, he was. 4, really not.
Okay, we'll go with 3-year-old then.
Yeah, we'll
Thank you.
downgrade it to 3. Excellent.
But it does talk about how the ruling part changes as you go down this ladder, like the rational, and then you get to the spirited. It starts talking about loves and desires, right? Which is kind of, we don't really like to. I think we don't really. I didn't like to hear that. Like, I wanna allow my the things that I love to guide me in some way. And so it's like saying, like, there's a kind of a rational part. You have to moderate that spirited signal with the rational part, and then if you corrupt that too much, then you're going to be led by the lower part. Now I'll leave it at that 'cause I'm getting too far ahead. But I'm seeing that I am seeing like the battle that's being fought just sort of changes. But there is this proactive element of agency involved throughout the whole process that I'm seeing.
Yeah, so the line that I have here is appease the lower to make room for the higher. So basically what he says is you have to do upkeep, and then like virtue can exist. And if you don't do upkeep, we all have a lawless wild beast nature waiting. Necessary appetites encouraged in the democratic man who's capable of balancing the unnecessary, right? So that's why that distinction is so important. Like okay, you get to be doing all of these things as a democratic nutbag, but like if you stop making the judgment, you stop making the discernment between what's necessary and what's unnecessary, you just fall down the hill. Yeah, and so like this is Epicureanism, at least the way that it was shown in Hypatia. So I'm like super confused. Yeah. Then the tyrannical man is seduced by perfect liberty. The need to control is done through implementation of a ruling desire or passion, self-control. So the way I understood this, because it was a little bit weird in the text, but the way I I understood it is that you submit yourself to something else, and then that something else will rule you, and then it will organize your life into it. And then that also becomes the means of others to control you. So like it gives you a means to control yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm going to have pie at the end of the day or whatever, right?
Right.
But also, like other people can take away your pie. Or, yeah, like the oil pipeline gets closed, or the gas pipeline or whatever.
That jives with the trials that he puts this tyrant man through when he says, if you're the rational man, like what's best to the rational man is what he values, what's best to the honor-loving man is what he values, etc. Right? So that seems, whatever you put on the top of your hierarchy, that's gonna. I'll save it for later. Sorry, but yeah, I see that in the trials that come later.
So. The quote that I have here is monstrous winged drone. So it's not only a winged drone, it's monstrous as well. Yeah. And then he goes into the need to remove all constraints. Then I have old love, although I don't know what that's referencing to anymore. But I think that's the detachment from everything that was loved in the past, right? So, and oh yeah, this is the framing that I wanted to go into. We're talking about bondage because that's what a slave is, right? Like a slave is involuntary bondage, right? And you have voluntary bondage and involuntary bondage. And the old laws, right? Like love is a voluntary bondage because you engage in it. And if you cast it off and you adopt these new bonds, right? Like where, and I think the important part of it is that it's not an intimate relationship because the tyrannical man is incapable of intimacy. And I think actually Plato says something similar to that they can't, they don't know what's freedom. Anyway, we'll get. So yeah, so that there's a born againness in the inverted way there. Like you're baptized in the drunken man's spirit. That's the comparison that they're making. Drunken man's spirit is the spirit of the tyrant. The spirit that gets taken, well, that reason does not rule anymore.
Yeah, all the relationships that the tyrant has are of a master-slave relationship, and they in terms of redeeming qualities, he does talk about friendship. Like, you know, he says he's incapable of friendship, and so
Right.
that does seem to be, in terms of, we talk about there's no solutions. That does seem to be a theme that actually is brought up in many of the books as of having inherent virtue and of being an anti-corrosive, you know, an anti-corruptive thing, is uniting with other people under the right spirit.
Yeah, and then he thinks he can not only rule over man, but also over God. So, yeah, that relates to humility, groundedness, right? It's and it also says something about the relationship that you're entering into, because if you're not looking up in your relationship, you can only relate downwards. I think that's basically what it means, right? And then that's only one-way communication. There we go. Like,
Yep.
because then you have to broadcast. Like there's no other means of communicating if you're only looking down. You have to broadcast.
Well,
So-
that's what broadcast is. You're putting yourself at the top in order to cast a broad net, right? Like you can't cast a broad net from below. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work.
The rule not just human beings but gods as well, like you said. Reminds me of in Christian lore, that's the very first sin, is taking the fruit so that you may be like gods. It's like the very first sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing that came to mind for me was technology and misattributing what technology can, what the bounds of what it can and can't do are. But what did you guys think about, like, in terms of like madness, or thinking that you can rule over gods? Is that just a, I mean, there's some force multiplier, like you're being empowered in some way, but I think there's more to it than that. Like, I think there's some other aspect to madness here that it's not just sheer.
Like what is the state of being where there's nothing above you?
That's God.
Well, yeah,
That's you at the top.
but what is your experience? How do you navigate the world if there's
You're
nothing above?
separated from the whole in that situation.
No, you are the whole.
Yeah, you're going around making the world in your own image.
So it's like
You
the
are
ego.
the whole. This is narcissism, right? Like this is solipsism. Everything only exists in relation to me. And therefore, all value is how values apply to me. Like, so if you want something, like the only reason I would give it to you is because it would serve me. And then, this is the next line. Comes into being through influence of nature or habit? Because what are the things that rule you? The way that you go, right? Your pre-programming, or the structural programming around you that constrains you. Like, that's the two ways that you get manifest. And then the qualities are drunken, lustful, and passionate, right? Because that's the things that can grab your attention because they have positive valence in some sense, right? Love is his Lord. Orders the concerns of the soul, right? So that's a reorganizing of the hierarchy of attention. Desires grow and place high demands, including debt and loss of property. So if you take a less material look at those, right? Like, so what is debt? What debt means, being bound, right? Like you're binding yourself to something. There's a dependency, and a loss of property means a loss of authority. Like you lose claim on being the author of the land. So that's the two things that are going on. You become dependent, and you become subject. Self-love controlled by desires, right? So that's becoming self-referential. Like, and then in order to sustain that, we get to the breaking of the law, right? So this is a rejection of the outside structure.
Rejection of constraint as such.
Right. Well, restraint that doesn't serve you. But it's still goal oriented, right? So we're effectively looking at the path of regression that's being followed. He's addicted and forced to acquire money, right? So money is potential, right? Acquires the means to achieve his ends. The young claims more than the old. And so this is also relational hierarchy, right? Like, so the bones of the ancestors, right? Like, you don't need it anymore. We're going to have to live on the planet. We don't care about how you live because we need to save the climate, right? That's sort of stuff. Either convincing or deception, right? So that's the preferred means, or through force. The son will establish tyranny over the parents. The mother, which is likened to the source of being, an ancient friend, gets subjected. So I think we want to spend some time on this.
You have a section where that's at? I have 74, 75 or something.
Not directly.
Yeah, I think in general though the pattern is it switches how it's doing the patterns in these later books, right? Going from talking about the tyrannical man to basically talking about what happens to the family and as a result what his son is like. So the first generation tyrant is not the problem. It's a problem, but the real problem is the son that follows him.
I don't know if that was generally there, right? Because the father and mother usually represented the higher state of being, so I think that's still a reference to democratic father, but
Yeah,
I
but they
don't
got
think-
wiped out.
Well,
The tyrannical man models a bunch of stuff for his son, and then the son comes and basically murders his parents.
Okay.
Sounds like a Sith Lord. There can only ever be two. And the only path of succession is to kill the master. That was such a cool. There's such a cool idea that they never really developed.
But it's not succession, though. That's the interesting part.
So one thing that came to mind when in 575 C or D, it's like it says that they were assisted by the infatuation of the people. It's almost like there's a movement that already exists in the class of people, and then they choose from among them who is the most tyrant, like, right? So it's kind of like if Adolf Hitler wasn't in that position, somebody else would have been in that position. That was kind of the model that it seemed to be described bottom up and not top down. It's not like some force comes top down and makes you a slave. It's like it's like that class of people together are working together. They have a uniting hate. You know, they have things, you know, that they share in common, that they grow into a bigger and bigger hydra as we get to the end of it.
No, it's not the sharing in common. Like
No,
I
it's not.
don't.
Yeah, it's the fact that they don't share anything in common, and so they aren't intimate, and so they can't get anything done. They have a desire to do things because life, basically, like life is doing things. And so what happens is, to your point, it emerges from below. This is why emergence is not good. Hitler was one among many such characters who could have emerged. He just happened to be the one that emerged. And that spirit takes over, and that's what develops the tyranny. I mean, that's how it eats the world, basically, or tries to, and succeeds for a while.
So, if you look at what's being valued, right? So if honor is being valued, you play one game, right? Everybody plays that game, and the only way to succeed is by that game. If money is being valued, there's many games, right? But they're still united in money. So when you go to a passion, right? So if I start a child trafficking ring, right? You have to participate in the child trafficking ring in order to succeed and gain things. Because if you don't, there's nothing for you, right? So you don't have to go here, but then you have to go to the arms dealing or whatever, drugs dealing. But if you want to participate in my child trafficking, you got to do the child trafficking things. And so they're not united by the child trafficking. They're united because they desire things, and the means to manifest it is shared, because else they can't manifest.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if there's what did you just say? The things that they desire, they're not desired. If your desire isn't grounded in virtue, things are going to creep up, and you're going to the polis, whatever, the people are going, or the group, the society is going to allow unethical things to emerge because they don't care, because they don't, child trafficking it's irrelevant in regards to what they're desiring. So the spirit of the whole city society has changed and allows things like drugs and child trafficking, arms to emerge because they don't care. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's not in conflict with what they're desiring.
Well, I don't know if they don't care, right? But I think in the democratic man, we saw that they lost the basis for judgment. Like they didn't have anything to appeal to anymore to condemn it, right? You can still condemn things if you don't have an appeal, right? Like the tyrant condemns things without an appeal because he's appealing to himself. Like, but
yeah, you're right.
that's not efficient, right? And like this is what all these people are doing, right? Like we need to create awareness, because if we have awareness, we can appeal to it. Like,
Right.
Oh,
But that's the appeal to OMR, right? What we're not saying is we need to have awareness of OMR, the objective material reality, so that we can all find agreement in that OMR. Unfortunately, OMR doesn't exist, and even if it did,
yeah.
that wouldn't be how it would work.
That's a really interesting point. This whole awareness thing, I say, because they're trying to bring awareness to things that are already created or already have manifested themselves, as opposed to bringing awareness to things that are pre-created, or which would be virtue, right? You can't,
Yeah.
because in OMR, virtue doesn't exist, so you can't bring attention to it. So they only have a choice, is to bring awareness to created things. So you're either at best it's the same thing. You're either identifying in or against something that's already created, and we already know that you can't, from Sam Harris, that you can't derive a good from a bad. You can't infer virtue from something that's already created.
yeah,
You
or
can't infer something uncreated from something that's created.
you have to stand on the bed to look up, because like for whatever reason, right, the awareness, right, like I'm being awakened to the importance, and now I can there's heaven, or like a piece of heaven, and if I stand on the victim, right, like literally, if I empathize with the victim, I stand on the victim, then I can look up and I know what's right, which might actually be true, but also insufficient.
Oh, but you're
Yeah.
not looking up. They're not looking up. I mean, I thought what you said was excellent, Ethan. As always, that was really good. But what choice do they have, right? Like in a world where reality pre-exists and you're conforming to it, right? In a world of something unchanging through time that you conform to, you can't look into the future because it's uncertain, right? So you have to look at something that's quote created. You can't look at potential and future and possibility, because their whole appeal is to conform to something already there, right? That's the objective material reality. Objective material reality is already there. It's going to be there in the future. It's been there in the past. It's there right now. And that's why simple awareness. If you were just aware of that, all the problems would be, even if that were true, the awareness wouldn't have that effect. And like we know this psychologically, we know this from physics experiments, like we actually like experimentally, according to science, know that that isn't even true. And yet they act as if like awareness is going to solve a problem, because they make this assumption of the universal unchanging nature of objective material reality. And so the OMR appeal makes perfect sense. It also makes a flat, reduced, compressed world, and it's not representative of anything interesting. And it doesn't work if it doesn't happen that way. And if reality is co-manifested from your actions, which I don't know how anybody could come to any other conclusion, but apparently we're just living in a world where no one's ever thought about this. Obviously, your decision uh, to eat one thing over another in the past, would reveal a different reality, and therefore reality must have some interaction with your decisions. Otherwise, yeah, you don't have free will, and that seems kind of silly to even ponder.
This may not be super relevant to anything, but to me it is kind of comical how simple like the methodology of medical science is, where you get things like the recommendation that you sleep 8 hours or the food pyramid. If you look at the studies, it's like, okay, we ask 1,000 people who like you kind of seem like you're sort of healthy, and you just ask them like how much do you sleep, 7, 9, 7.5. They literally just average the numbers, and like that's the recommendation. That's how medical science is done, and like obviously methodologically there's huge. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. It's important to be aware of how simple these things really are, and I'll just leave it at that. In terms of when you listen to authority and
Yeah,
Right,
what's
but
most real.
they have to be to some extent. Like the authority doesn't know you personally and can't. And so, and that's the problem with the hierarchy. Like the hierarchy has to communicate. I mean, this is the problem that's outlined, in book 7, is that the philosophers don't want to be taken away from their pursuit of moving ever closer to the good, but they have to be. And when they're taken away from that and brought to the lowest level of the city, they're not brought back into a cave. When they're brought to the lowest level of the city and they say, hey guys, look, this is terrible, you need to fix it, they're hated. Fair enough. Like, but that's how it works. Like, it cannot work any other way, because the people who can't see aren't going to agree. And you could ask yourself, well, once they're shown it, they can't be shown it. If they already had the capacity to see that this was bad, they wouldn't have manifested it in the first place. So they have to be told to clean it up and trust in faith, maybe, that the philosophers are telling the truth and that they're seeing things accurately, because you can tell the truth of what you see, it's still true, but not see things accurately. Like, there's a lot of trust and faith going on. All of that at every level is imperfect. And yeah, that's the problem of hierarchy. Also, that's the problem, and it's not going away. So suck it up, Buttercup.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. They might. I like that what you said. That, like, when they come back to the bottom, the very depths of the city, um, they're rebuked, right? And that's actually in a weird cosmic way necessary. And yeah, it's almost by like the 100th person that you feed to lions that it starts to get recognized.
Well, and they could be wrong. Like, the philosophers could be missing something. It's not
Mhm.
like because they're philosophers and they're, quote, on high in that particular iteration of book 7, which is no longer the parable of the cave at all, or the allegory of the cave, even a little bit. We moved way past that allegory by that point. It's not made clear that they actually have perfect vision and sight. Some of the things they may think need to be cleaned up, cleaning them up may destroy the world. And if you look around, you might see that pattern manifest now. Like, oh, we did away with physical signatures, and now you can do electronic signatures. And what happens? Fraud goes through the freaking roof the minute that law is passed in the United States. It was the mid '90s. I remember it well. And so it's like, well, yeah, we don't need this. It's totally unnecessary to have a physical signature and physically be in front of somebody to validate their identity. Really? That seems a little weird. And you do away with it, and sure enough, and I'm not saying it's ultimately better or worse, but there's a bad side effect there that's pretty significant. I mean, people's lives get wiped out by identity theft now, and that never used to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a constant reminder that coming from the pragmatist of the group that we're in creation, right? And um, things need to work. You can't like you have to remember that we're within creation, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the better, as you so wisely coined that term. Yeah,
So,
that's interesting.
I want to go to the philosopher king, because I think the qualification that Socrates gave was that the true philosopher king would have to know the form of the good. And it's like,
Right.
okay, right? So you know the form of the good. But even if you do know the form of the good, now you have your body, right? You have your extensions
Right.
in the city. And they might be corrupted, right? Not
Right.
intentionally, but like they might have insufficient information coming to you. So even if you have perfect sight, you don't have perfect awareness.
Right. Well, and even if you had perfect sight and perfect awareness, you don't have perfect implementation because your body is not perfect. So even the awareness, and this is what we in recent times, the problem that we have is that we keep identifying one thing that's wrong and saying, okay, this is the one thing that's preventing us from manifesting utopia or whatever we're trying to manifest. And it's never one thing. And so they fix the one thing, and then that doesn't actually work, right? Because there's more than one thing, and it's on and on and on. So even if you fix the awareness problem, And if you think about the realm of Platonic forms, or the Idos, I think is a better way to think about it. You can see that we had the Philosopher Kings 2 books ago. Then we get into democracy, which is equality doctrine, which collapses. And now nobody cares about anything outside themselves. And because they don't care about anything outside themselves, they are possessed by it as a winged drone, right? And they're basically not only consuming the things around them, but their desires are consuming them at the same time. And so you end up feeding the desires of whoever's at the top of the hierarchy at the time, to the earlier point, right? Like, it's not clear if it's actually the physically strongest or the physically biggest or the scariest or the, you know, the most bombastic, whatever rises to the top in the tyranny. It is being consumed by the winged drone of desire. And in order to feed its desires, it's consuming the slaves below it effectively. And so, and I think that may be part of the confusion of the parable, so-called parable of the so-called cave, which is still Den in my book, by the way. You know, you're extending this allegory long past its life, at least according to Plato, and according to the book. Like, read the book, and so you're getting sort of confused with the problem posed by the allegory with the problem posed by book 8, which is the demolition of the utility of trying to equalize everything through democracy. So democracy and equality in some sense are kind of the same thing, or one leads to the other, however you want to think about it. And then that devolves into this hyper individualism. And this is where, unfortunately, I hate to do this, Jordan Peterson is obviously wrong, right? Because he says the individual is the highest,
Yeah,
is the logical end conclusion, but he doesn't really understand. No, that means individual desire consumes not you, but causes you to consume everyone else.
yeah. Every time Jordan Peterson says the sovereign individual, I just kind of cringe.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard him say it for a long time, so I don't.
Yeah, no, he needs to go say the autonomic individual.
Right. Well, I mean, it was interesting, right? Because he was using it mostly as a way to destroy the ideas of what we now call woke, which, you know, were kind of pre-woke or something, whatever, right? The hyper liberalism should lead to the individual being at the top, and it's like, did you read book 9 of the Republic? Because that's not a good thing, and we know why, or at least Plato knew why. The question is why we forgot. And again, I mean, why aren't the so-called modern philosophers screaming about this literally every day at the top of their lungs? Guys, middle of book 8 all the way through book 9. I'm just saying, like, look around. This is a problem. And so why this isn't more widely talked about or discussed or used as a warning, I don't know. I'm a little freaked out by it, honestly, still.
People get clueless when a tyrant in a democracy, you know, when we'll just call it equality in a society of equality, when somebody rises up with power and they just don't understand why would that person want to rise up to power and tyrannize everybody? Well, you just implanted them in a society where the highest value is their own individuality and their own desire. What did you expect?
Right.
And I mean, this, you could argue that the same thing is happening in something. You know, you could probably identify this pattern somewhere. What's happening in geopolitics right now at this point? You know.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you relate that to China or Russia, and like why people don't understand China and Russia, right? Because they're thinking they're tyrants on top, but it's not tyrants on top. That's they're
Oligarchs.
autocrats. They're not tyrants. They're autocrats.
Yeah. Totally different. Yeah, they're not recognizing the stage of government they're actually in.
Since we're talking about
Because
how,
it's not
sorry.
Like that's the problem. It's a bomb, which is ironic.
Literally. Well, and they're only recognizing democracy and tyranny. And it's like, it's not a
Right.
binary, guys.
It's like tyranny is the absolute worst thing. We must have democracy.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like Lord help us. That's why
Is it-
I keep wanting that T-shirt, the God Save the King.
Is that
I need
is that what you want? Tyranny? Because democracy, that's how you get tyranny. And
Right.
it's like, yes.
So I want to get back to the book a little bit because, like, what do we think about Mother being described as the ancient friend and the source of being?
It's interesting.
Yeah, like that was really weird, right? And then the mother gets subjected, right? So in some sense, right, that she's representing the generative principle, right? Like that from which you came or something. But then that's perverted, right? Like it's put under you instead of that it provides you, right? Like it comes at you, and then the father is described as the first and indispensable friend.
Last week I watched a little talk Schindler gave on Dionysus, and Dionysus said that being is the first gift from God, which is very interesting,
Right.
and that it's really well with if you look at Catholic and Orthodox tradition, the veneration of Mary and the Mother of God. It's the very first. Being is the first gift, and if she is, what did you say? The grounding of being. It's very interesting.
No, the source.
Source of being. Yeah. So
And that's the feminine, like the matrix, like that which holds generation, right? Like it's the womb in which things happen.
Yeah. Oh, I really like that. Where is that?
In my head, like every time.
We got to be 574D in that area.
Yeah, maybe we should read it with different translation.
What about when the possessions of his father and mother give out? With the great swarm of pleasures inside him, won't he first try to break into someone's house or snatch someone's coat late at night? Then won't he try to loot a temple? And in all of this, the old traditional opinions that he held from childhood about what is fine or I don't know if this is the right part of it.
Yeah, it is. The Bloom translation says a swarm of pleasures densely gathered in him, by the way. Which is interesting.
Oh yeah, it's right with the drones.
Well, and this idea of now acting as love's bodyguard and conquering along with it, right? And then these are the opinions that formed early release in dreams in sleep when still under laws and a father, there was a democratic regime in him. But once a tyranny was established by love, right? So the tyranny is established by love. What he had rarely been in dreams, he became continuously while awake. And so that rarity, that rare sort of vision that you had when you were sleeping is now something you become 24/7 while you're awake.
Yes.
So there's
right.
that denigration of dreams and that elevation of the sort of conscious state of being, we'll say.
Well, it's not. No, I think the wakeness is like the falling asleep is the removal of vigilance, right? And now, when you've been indoctrinated, while you're vigilant, you're not aware of these things, right? Or they're not nature to you. I think that's the way I see that.
So, since we're at the murder of the sarcastic line, how very blessed it seems to be to bear a tyrannic son, where he just murdered his parents. I just did want to put on the table this idea that there's this theme in Christianity. There's redemption requires the death of something innocent. Like in Genesis, when Adam and Eve sinned, they needed clothes, which is technology, and that's made of a dead animal, and that creates a separation. Or in Judaism, the purification rituals required water. They require like purification water, which they had to burn a dead calf and then take the ash of the dead calf, because the water, like if you touch a dead person or something, you're now impure and you need to be purified. But you had to do it with the ritual purification water, and there was always this theme of it requiring the death of something innocent. We're talking about how desire consumes what's lower in the stack, and same thing like when the philosopher went into the cave, he was killed. So I mean, we see death here is not being done in a redemptive way. I don't know exactly what the death of the innocents, what that points to, or what the relevance of that is, but there is definitely I don't know. I just wanted to point that out because
Well, the
there's
parents aren't innocent at all, so there's no death
True.
of innocence.
true, yeah.
I mean, the father's tyrannical.
So yeah,
And the
let me
mother
read.
doesn't constrain him. So
So let me read it, because I think the version of mine is reading. So, but O heavens, Adamanthius, on account of some newfound love of a harlot, who is anything but a necessary connection, can you believe that he would strike his mother, who is his ancient friend and necessary to his very existence? So there's a harlot, right, which would be like the external coming into the home, right? But it's not a necessary external. And then ancient friend and necessary to his very existence, right? So that's a continual dependence. Would he place her under the authority of the other, right? So he's taking the external and placing it above the root of his existence. When she is brought under the same roof with her, or that, under like circumstances, he would do the same to his withered old father, first and most indispensable of friends, for the sake of some newly found blooming youth, who is the reversible of indispensable. Right? So that's a cutting of the ties, right? The cutting of the thing that works, the branch that you're sitting on, and replacing it with something of no value out of whim.
Whatever from the outside. You don't know what it is. You don't have the judgment to see if it's good or not, but you bring it in and replace it with that which is above you.
Right.
There's
Surely,
something.
then I said, the tyrannical son is a blessing to his father and his mother.
There's something. I remember there's a video Pajot did a couple weeks ago, and they're talking about the curse of Ham. And there's something similar going on there, where Ham was trying to usurp the authority of the identity of his own father, inserting himself. I think it's the same thing going on here. As he's removing that which is above him and placing and forcibly putting himself on that throne, I guess, if you would.
Right.
And then
Like I got now related to the story of Jacob, I think, right? So he got gifted a cloak of many colors by his father, right? And then because he has it, he gets envied and he gets thrown in a well and he gets cast out to Egypt, right? So there's something there with like this inheritance from the father and like how that's mediated and how that goes wrong. And in some sense, right, like what is the cloak of the tyrannical man? Right? It's just whatever he finds outside that suits his liking.
Yeah, it's the one he stole from at nighttime from some guy on the street.
Right. So
So what's interesting that you
Well,
mentioned that
he
they
breaks
talk about
into the
how
house, yes. Yeah.
they talk about how he becomes like less able, the tyrant, as he becomes more powerful, is he becomes like more incompetent. And so like if you're composed of things that you've stolen, you're yeah, like you said, like it's like a vampire. You're not actually developing the generative capacity to make the cloak or buy the cloak yourself. You're becoming weak when you do that, fundamentally.
Right. So yeah, if we go through this, right? So then he breaks into a house, right? So that's property, but it's the acquisition of property by false means from others, right? And then steals the garments, right? So that's imitation, right? Like that's taking credit for other people's stuff. And next he proceeds to clear the temple. So now we're at desecration, right? We're taking the sacred and we're employing the sacred to our means. Meanwhile, the opinions which he had when a child, which gave judgment about good and evil, are overthrown by those others which have just been emancipated and are now the bodyguard of love and share his empire. These, in his democratic days, when he was still subject to the laws and to his father, were only let loose in the dreams of sleep. But now that he is under the dominion of love, he becomes always and in a waking reality what he was when very rarely in a dream only.
Interestingly, there are a few such men in the city, right? But all the tyrants basically get together and either are at the top or serve other tyrants. And so he's putting back in other people, right? He had taken all the other people out. He's putting them back in and says they do many small deeds, right? Steal, break into houses, cut purses, right? Bear false witness, and take bribes. But they all gather together and serve whoever the biggest tyrant is. So they're
because there's no other place. I think that's the issue, right? Like, so the gathering principle is not a shared thing, but it's being outcast.
Well, no, it's being tyrannical. It's being in the tribe of tyrants. It's not being outcast. They're not outcasts. There's no law.
You think it's a positive thing? I don't think it's a positive.
I don't think it's a positive thing at all. I think that tyranny begets tyranny. And so many tyrants like the idea, because they still have to look up, so they look up to the big tyrant and serve him. And you see that pattern pretty much throughout history, where the most competent tyrant of the tyrants is at the top, and all the other tyrants are serving him, and they try to rise through the ranks. They never get out of that system. Like, you can't escape the inevitability of hierarchy and the attraction of that which is at the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah, what struck me about this passage was it's how it's talked about how the old opinions which you valued when you were a child and how you corrupt your judgment, and then as you start to serve the lower parts of yourself, they become the bodyguard of love, like the corrupt conscience. That's kind of a scary image. Like, I don't know, that just jumped out to me as, I mean, I've seen that pattern.
That's hell,
yeah.
right? That's being your own gatekeeper. Correct?
It's kind of scary to think about,
Well, and therefore they live their whole life without ever being friends of anyone. Always one man's master or another's slave. The tyrannical nature never has a taste of freedom or true friendship. So freedom is cast as also not having slaves. Yeah, because you're disconnected from the world. Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Can't be on either end of that.
So here, the father and mother are compared to fatherland and motherland being subjugated. That was also really curious to me. So I think I get a better sense of what fatherland and motherland is. Like motherland is in some sense alien to you, right? Because like the mother might come from a different land, uh, while the fatherland is the direct inheritance. So that's interesting.
The motherland is the land from which you took your sustenance of nourishment, which is different than the political force.
Oh yeah, that's also culture and stuff. Yeah, that. Thank you.
Just real quick, on to rewind a little bit on the freedom thing, because they talk about how the tyrant is the one who he's an ill-governed person and he has to be master of others when he's not even the master of himself, like a sick person who's compelled to be an athlete. I think their idea is like if you're not of the type of person who's capable of being a leader or a master, then you can't have slaves, right? So it's more like, I think, of being out of place. Like not everyone should own slaves, but I think there's also the role of the king, and there's a role of for people to submit under the king.
Well, in relation to the submittance, right? Like without power, they submit to the state of being, right? Like how things are going, and they're being opportunistic. But when they gain power, they leave their relationships or their bonds. That's the way I framed that behind. So I think you can be under a king, and you can be willing to be dying for a king. So the thing that I was thinking about is in Wheel of Time, right? There's this he kills like the elites, right? The nobles of this aristocratic society, and then he saves their servant, and then the servant is, yeah, I'm gonna go with them, and he kills himself, right? So that's one way of being a slave, right? And so this is why I'm a little bit objecting to the way that Plato frames this, right? But there's a different way where that would have been correct, right? But in that situation, that wasn't correct, because like you just took away the whole identity of that person.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's why we didn't kill the emperor in Japan. The mother and father-in-law or motherland fatherland thing is really interesting because you'll fight for the direction of the fatherland, but you'll die for the motherland because that's saying all sustenance. It's a very different relationship, which is why it should concern you anytime you're talking to a Russian, because it's only the motherland, and you should take that freaking seriously. That's a positive, actually, on their behalf, and like. Americans don't really have that, and so like, yeah, which I think we do, but it's more underneath because of our relationship with Mary, probably. But because America the Beautiful is a love song to the mother, but we never use those terms. It's weird.
Well, I was thinking about Napoleon, right? And I think Napoleon flipped that, right? Like he let everybody die for the fatherland instead of the
Well,
mother.
yes, but that's fighting for. That's not dying sacrifice. It's different. There's a nuance. They're kind of the same thing, and they're kind of different.
No. Napoleon killed off the French because he didn't like the French because he was Corsican and they took away his wealth, and he did the "I'm disappointed in you because you didn't win the war for me and I'm your emperor" thing. So there were two negative motivations for him to basically destroy the population of the country that he was ostensibly trying to rule. So, but that is reflected in when these men in private life before they rule, aren't they like this? In the first place, as to their company, either they have intercourse with their flatterers who are ready to serve them in everything, or if they have need of anything from anyone, they themselves cringe and dare to assume any posture, acting as though they belong to him. But when they have succeeded, they become quite alien. In other words, in not being able to accept proper praise, right, or proper help from people, you remove yourself from the world, right? There's the intimacy crisis, right? You remove yourself from the world, and now you're an alien, like you're not in of the world, and that allows you to be a tyrant.
One of C.S. Lewis's books, and I don't know if it's the Screw Tape Letters or one of them. It's one of the very dry saltine cracker ones. They pull up this hero from the dead, and he's like a Greek hero, and he's existing with them in modern England of C.S. Lewis's time, and he's remarking upon the windows, and he's amazed by the house, but then he's incredibly frustrated that there's no one to wash his feet and no one to bring him his things, and he's like, "You are both kings and servants here," and he's just like ranting about the state of man, and there's no hierarchy in the house, and you all have things of lordship constantly at your whim, and yet you take no dominion over each other, and no one knows their place, and just this whole thing. And that reminds me of that, because I think it's even more intense now, because it's like, well, who's right? Oh, the customer is always right, and so on and so on and so on. And so like that's being treated like a lord, very in a non-healthy, it's a non-healthy way, because you should be coming with alms, like, please bestow on me electricity, please. Not the customers. You can't go get a different electric company. That's insane. Anyway, yeah.
And so having sex with your flatterers, that's a bubble, right? Like that's self-referential, like not engaging with ideas.
Did you say Hollywood? Did you? Oh, I just heard Hollywood. Hollywood.
Yeah, me too. So.
Stop being a materialist.
No, you said Hollywood, dude.
Hollywood.
Yeah.
Just for what it's worth, this is kind of besides the point. You lose a lot of the graphic language in the Jolette translation. The Bloom translation is a lot more graphic.
I like it.
It's good. No, I don't think that's graphic. I think that we flatten the language. Intercourse does not actually mean sex, and it never did.
No, it doesn't there. But there were many. There were many places. I read both translations this whole book. There were many places where it was just everything was just generally more explicit than in the Jolette translation.
It should completely activate your disgust. Like, I'm kind of barfing, but like, no, you should. You should be that disgusted by it. And that is the beauty of alliteration. Like, you should alliterate it, and you should make it very personal in a way that people can't ignore it, because that's what that's for.
They've done a good job of ignoring it so far, Sally.
Well,
you were doing something?
Or not.
Yeah.
I'll go back to putting up my insulation.
So, so we get a qualification for the tyrannical man as treacherous and unjust. So they kind of did a definition there, but yeah. And then the state and the man mirror themselves in manifestation. So this is the as above, so below. But I think everybody's using that wrong.
No,
like
it's not. It's not. He's doing the flip again, right? Where he's saying, instead of the man is reflected of the city is reflected of the man, right? And so he keeps playing with that idea. In other words,
but
you can't
this
get
is the
around the
fractal
reciprocal
nature.
relationship between where you're born into and what your your personal nature is.
Yes, but it's you are what you eat, right? But the way that people use the as above, so below is that there's a literal correlation between above and below, instead of that they affect each other and they resonate instead of are identical.
Relationship. It's a relationship, right? And the only time that relationship becomes a problem, as outlined here, is when you either embrace it, right, or remove it, right? That's you're having intercourse with your flatterers, or you're pretending like you don't need any. And that's when you become alien. And because you're alien, you can be tyrannical because you're not connected to the things you're doing anymore. That's what a tyrant is. A tyrant is somebody who's disconnected from the people he or she is affecting. That's how we perceive tyranny. Whether we actually talk about it that way or not is irrelevant. if you listen closely, that's what people are saying. That the tyrant is any person who's disconnected or somebody feels is disconnected from the results of their actions, they just cast them as a tyrant. Now, often that isn't true. It's just that you're on the wrong end of that particular bargain. And maybe you're in the minority, and that's the right answer because you don't want to you don't want to inconvenience the 90% for the 10%. That doesn't make any sense. That'll destroy your city by definition. And so you don't know. But also that's sort of the pattern. And I think actually that's where the whole thing changes. So it might be a good point to land things.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to set up the frame a little bit. So now we need to look at the state as a whole in relation to the tyrant. I don't think we've adopted that framing yet.
Didn't you make that point earlier, Mark, that there is that it's not scalable. It's not what's the word that we use? It's not whatever. You can't look at it at the level of the state because it doesn't exist. It can't exist. A tyrannical state actually doesn't exist. It's almost like the definition of a tyrannical state is absolute destruction. So that's why it's only looking at it at the individual level, right? And as we know, the word for individual in Greek means idiot.
Right.
And
right.
we're just reading about
the state of tyranny
the
the state of tyranny is the consumption of that at the top of all the things below it. So it's technically the dissolution of a city. It's the thing that makes the city no longer be a city because it descends effectively into chaos as the result of the equality doctrine from the democracy.
Yeah, exactly. So we're in a weird position because we're kind of longing for an eidos of tyranny, but tyranny is a deprivation of being, right? And so you can't have because it's non-dualistic, right? You can't have a negative identity. There's just identity, and you get less and less identity until you get to nothing. There's not an inverse, right? And that's why we can't see this going.
But
we can't see this going into the scale of a city.
But you can have a negative movement. And I think that's what people are like. I'm thinking about this conversation I had earlier today, and it's like
asymmetry.
There's so much going on, but
asymmetry.
Yeah,
don't recognize that idea.
But the point, what are these people looking for in a tyranny, right? Like, let's just say we start with the climate tyranny, right? So we can create a movement in a direction, and we can participate in the movement, right? And because we're in the movement, we're doing something, right? And we're doing something that we can judge by a shared standard. So we create the illusion that we're manifesting something, but the thing that's being manifested is self-referential. That's the problem, right? Like it's its own standard, and that's insufficient, right? But it can last for a while, as long as it can feed upon that which upholds it.
Yeah, we're back into this identifying in created things as opposed to identifying in uncreated things. It's this weird thing. This had me thinking about the number 0, and what 0 is it's the point in between negative numbers and positive numbers. And I looked this up. I said, when did we start using 0? Like, when did that start becoming a normal thing that we use? Guess when about the time it was. Take a wild guess.
Romanticism.
It was around the 16th century. So in other words, around the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. Yeah, and it was actually forbidden, from what I understand, it was actually forbidden to be used commonly by the church because the church regarded it as being associated with evil. And of course, as moderns are like, oh, silly church, why would you think that 0 is evil? It allows us to do calculus and all of these build buildings and stuff. Well, what it does is it allows the 0 existed and people would still use it. They just didn't want it commonly used because it can be abused, right? It's like forbidden knowledge, right? So it allows you into thinking that the world can be, that there's symmetries, right? You can have anti this, you like the anti this
Right.
is a thing. It has just as much being as this does.
Right.
And then you start, what did you say, Manuel? You start so it becomes self-referential, right? So my identity is anti this identity, and it's not actually identifying in anything higher. It's actually using its own identity to give itself its own sustenance.
Well, and 0 is not a number technically,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's a placeholder, which is even more interesting. Peterson, right? 0 is a funny number. It's because it's not actually a number. But the interesting thing about 0 is that 2 has an opposite in -2. That opposite doesn't exist, to your point, without the 0 point. But in a very strange way, 0 is the exact opposite of all numbers, negative and positive. And so there's a deep asymmetry there. In other words, there's more nothingness or badness in the world than there is goodness.
Yes.
Quantitatively, like, let's just stay in the material frame. That's the problem. That's the asymmetry I was talking about. That's the important part. 0 represents asymmetry, and nobody realizes that, because without that 0 at the center of that line, the cancellation effect between 2 and -2 doesn't happen. It doesn't function. Math fails in some fundamental way.
Yeah. There's still a lot more that I need to think about with the number 0, but yeah, it's like if we can, if -2 theoretically exists, we can find +2. It's just not the way that the world works, and we fall into these delusions. That's why the church prevented people from using this number 0, because they were going to fall into traps.
Right, and then you don't get silly concepts like being in nothingness, sitting in meditation, trying to find the not you, or this state where nothing exists.
Algebra, silly concepts like algebra, that's what we don't need.
So
you don't need algebra to build a cathedral.
help me understand how
do,
identifying against is anti-referential in the climate case. So if the climate tyranny is pro non-destruction in theory, right? So are you saying that there is not
what? No, that's not what it is.
Well, that's what they would claim. They'd say, like, you know, you're wrecking the environment, and we're and because preserving the environment or not destroying the environment is more important than you being alive, we'll kill you rather than destroy the environment. But
the problem.
No.
So you're saying that it lacks an inverse, but
it's anti-nature. Because if there's too much of one animal, they'll start killing it. Because all animals, all organisms, all plants are destructive. You have to destroy to create. So,
okay, so it's a false position. There's no such position as being pro non-destruction of the environment.
That's right.
Destruction's built into the environment.
But it's even worse, because
and that's why there's no inverse.
Like, it's not pacifist. Like, you're creating a pacifist framing, and the climate people are not pacifist. They're activists.
Right.
So they want to create nature. They want to assign nature here, and they want to put 3 dogs and a cow. Like, that's what they want.
Right. They have no idea what they're doing, and it's pretty simple. It all comes down to this: is they're trying to define or infer non-destruction from destruction. Their first point of identity is destruction, and they're trying to identify non-destruction from destruction, and that doesn't work. You can't define.
No. But, like, that's not even what they're doing. At least not in the Netherlands. Like, if you hear the discussions here, right? It's like we need to go back. We need to get nature back in the Netherlands, right? And so we have like 1 square kilometers of ancient forest, and like that's like all the nature that we have. And what's ancient forest? Ancient forest is forest that's older than 400 years or whatever, right? So like we don't have any nature that's older than 400 years, right? But so what are they referencing when they want to get something back? referencing an arbitrary point in time, right? Like, ooh, this is when the Amish originated. We needed to go back to when the Amish originated, and that's how the Netherlands should look like.
Right.
And then
Wow,
they're
thinking.
going to say, well, in order to achieve that, what you're doing with your emissions is blocking us from having that manifest. So we need to cut your emissions because you're evil.
Right. Right. But at the same time, they're pretending like they didn't draw a standard or a line. They're pretending like nature already had the standard or line. We're not even appealing to that. We're just saying it exists, and therefore, but to Manuel's point, what they're actually doing is tricking you by picking a point and telling you that they didn't. And so the trick of all of these groups, it can be climate, it can be safety, it can be race, it can be any of these stupid groups, is the postmodern trick, which is you start from a bad axiom. You say something that is obviously incorrect. Like, we're pro anti-destruction. There's no such thing as pro anti-destruction. It doesn't make any sense, right? That's just gobbledygook talk. It doesn't function in the language to convey any sort of communication. And so they say that, you don't question it, and they move forward from there. Well, look, I've said it before. I can use reason, logic, and rationality to justify anything. Murder, Holocaust, genocide, anything you want. Logic, reason, and rationality are your guys. They can do that. All you have to do is start at one of the points where that conclusion is correct. Hitler did this. This isn't a magic secret. Hitler did it. Go listen to what Hitler said. It's not wrong. It's evil. It's unethical, but it's not scientifically, logically, or irrational. It's not incorrect scientifically. It's not incorrect. It's not illogical. It's not irrational. It's not unreasonable. It is wrong, though, and you have to know that. In the same way, you have to listen to the arguments that the quote pro-climate. You can be pro-climate. You're not part of the climate in some sense. Like, you're such a small, insignificant bug on the planet. The planet can't understand your existence, right? So they start from this idea that they are judging nature and saying what's good and bad about nature. And then they're saying, because I've made this judgment, what you're doing, I judge to be bad. But they're telling you they're not judging. This is just nature, right? It's very Rousseauian. It's just nature. It has nothing to do with me, even though I made all the judgments and did all the framing and told you what those judgments were and set those standards into your head. And so they're being tyrannical in that these are the standards I've picked. I didn't tell you I picked them, but it's
It's
obvious that they
entirely
did.
it's entirely arbitrary. It's deceptive. I mean, it all goes back to this. Like, I'm going to keep repeating this. It all goes back to their first point of identity, and their first point of identity is within creation. It's something created, and that's everything. All problems come from that. Nothing will ever work ever if your first point of identity is something that has already been created, something that's measurable, and that's what they're doing, and that's why it looks so silly when we look at it. It's like, what's their first point of identity? It's anti-destruction, blah 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 blah. It doesn't make any sense at all, and you build a whole logic.
Yeah.
But so the conversation I was having today was about, I want to have a non-biased perspective on the world. And I'm like, okay, why?
Right.
Because I want to see the world for what it truly is. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like what's the use of this? like for real. Like okay, you can do that. And then what? It's meaningless. Like, it's completely meaningless. And what are they looking for? Well, like, I was trying to get there, but like, obviously, yeah. Maybe shouldn't have gone there, but it's security. Like, it's looking for the sense of security, right? I don't want to make the wrong action, so I need to see things for what they truly are, so that I cannot make the wrong action. And then I went into this. Well, when I go outside, like, I want the world to be a certain way. I don't want it to be too hot, and I don't want it to be too cold. And I think that's right. Like I'm an embodied being, and I embrace that set of constraints, and I think it's actually good, right? Like, there's goodness in there, and right then you get the Sam Harris thing, right?
Yeah.
Like I yes, that's how I live the world, but I want this other world too. And it's like, but you're not living in that world. But I need that world because that's the world I can see.
Right.
And that's just it. And like it's all of these things. And it's like, well, I want to create the world what's creating the world I'm adapted to? It's creating the world where I can see, where I can have agency, where I can act. And like, if you don't have that, you fall into an existential anxiety, and like that's what people are fleeing. So yeah, I never liked this. Oh, all religions are about death, because like at least the way I understand it, like religions are maybe about dying, but they're not about death. Like that.
Right.
So I think standards is a good segue into landing the plane. Which state or man is most virtuous is where we'll pick up next time. The first proof that they're going to walk through.
Yeah, I'll repeat our intentions so we can use those in the reflection. So I try to be unstructured. Mark wanted to see what's happening. Then he wanted to meditate on madness and fear. Ooh.
I've been doing that for
And he
months.
didn't want to recognize the patterns in the modern world. Recognize
What did
this
what was Danny's again? Meditate on what?
on madness and fear, I think. Yeah.
Careful on that one.
Well,
We need to
he
give
was
him a
doing
lifeline.
abysmal.
We need to throw him a lifeline just in case something happens. To have something for him to grab onto.
You
I already have
can make
stories.
one
I'll
call
tell you
to
them
a
later.
friend, Danny.
I've got like 5 stories. All right.
Okay, let's reflect on what happened and set an intention for the week so that we can integrate our insights.